Okay, let's start talking about consideration. So up until this point in time, we've been talking about consideration as price. We've only got half an hour until it's time to head out here today. So what I am going to do today is a really high-level overview. We will start next week with a quiz, but in fact the quiz will be a problem. So if you look at the slides, you will see at the very end of the slide pack there is the Ace Cubbies problem, and we will work through that. So I am basically relying on you guys to be pretty prepared, and we will work backwards using that, and then we'll fill it in tomorrow, next Friday. It's called the Ace Cubbies problem, and it is the last page of the slides. I think it might even be in Canvas as a separate problem. If I am making these things up, somebody is going to tell me how crap I am really soon, and I'll make sure that it's there. When I do an announcement with the links to the recordings, there will be a reminder, and I will include in the announcement a reminder link, and I will bring some copies of it with me as well. So just a one-page little problem that we'll work through in class. Again, just using the quiz kind of methodology, but it helps us explore a whole lot of things. So consideration is one of the preconditions for the creation of a legally enforceable agreement. What are the other conditions for the creation or elements of a contract? Agreement, which comprises?
Offer and acceptance.
Offer and acceptance, always?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. What do we call it if we can't find offer and acceptance? Consensus, absolutely. Then we have consideration. What are the other two elements? Certainty. It certainly is. And intention. Okay, I know it's a bit boring, but you have to have that mantra. So what we're going to do across this topic, and I really am starting with a high-level overview, is we're going to actually just come to an understanding of what consideration is. And it's going to be a little bit frustrating because we're going to be looking at a whole heap of exceptions to the requirement for consideration, which ultimately will help us understand better what consideration is. I know I've been calling it price over and over again, and price is a good analogy, but it's not enough. It's not enough by itself. So, before we start, probably should have done this one before I started introducing. Just thought, let's just stop for a second. What's the thing that surprised you most so far about contract law? What do you know now that you didn't know 5 weeks ago? I will not accept that Kath is a nutter. Actually, I probably would. Yep, just have a go. Oh, is it active? Up. Few people are in there. I will open it up in a second. Again, completely anonymous. Oh. No. Just need to turn that into the next thing. There we go. Activate, show results. Oh, come on, Catherine. I try and make these things too fancy. Nope. It's only 2 of you who've got in there, so I've got plenty of time to...
You cleared them. There was more results before.
Show results.
Did I?
Yeah.
That's not good. That's a really common one, making contracts all the time and not always realising it. I want to remind you that you're seeing contracts out in the wild. More than signing a piece of paper, how often people think they're making a contract and they're not, and then They don't have legal obligations. Invitation to treat and offer. To me, I remember that being just like, okay, that's just like playing with my head when I was learning myself. And I just see it all the time because I deal with senior commercial people and they think they're making an offer and they're not. Distinction between an offer and invitation to treat. Another thing that often comes up in this space too is that that why you might structure something to be an invitation to treat as opposed to an offer. The one that gets my commercial clients all the time is I make a counter offer and the original offer leaves the table. Like it can be completely reversed. I don't think I understand what a capitalis is. Cool. Sorry, I want to get a sense and I want you to reflect on what you see as being different because there is a real benefit in actually recognising what you've learnt because particularly as you're writing assignments, you can go straight to the solution and actually just stand back and remember what you didn't know before you started the course is really important. I will share these answers with everybody as they come through. So, do we have a formula for consideration? That is the idea that I would like to think about. And I'm going to start with a flowchart. Let's talk first, though, about even the term consideration. So the doctrine of consideration requires that something needs to be given in return for a promise in order to make the promise binding. This idea of consideration is usually taken for granted. If I have a contract with somebody, I expect that somebody is going to do something that might be give me goods, perform services for me, or pay me money, in exchange for which I will pay them money, or I will give them goods, or I will perform services for them. It's usually taken for granted this idea that there will be some kind of exchange, and the exchange tends to be either of things or of things for a promise. So many contracts just happen in microseconds. I exchange my coins for your coffee. The consideration is the payment of money in exchange for the coffee, or conversely, the making and providing of a cup of coffee in exchange for money. However, in longer term contracts, the exchange might be of promises or of things for promises. So even if you think about an employment contract, you do work for an employer every day in exchange for the promise that they will pay you every fortnight or every month. There's an exchange of services for the promise for payment, plus a promise to continue to work on a certain basis and to not leave that employment without giving notice. Those promises are made in exchange for the promise to pay. Where does the word consideration come from? Again, 16th century, I don't think that we have a first case that uses the term, but the legal effect of a promise in the 16th century depended on the considerations or the factors that motivated the making of the promise. So I am making this promise in consideration of the work that you do, the goods or services that you provide, or the promises that you've made to me. And promises ultimately came to be enforceable when a promisee conferred some benefit on the promisor, or the promisee had acted to his or her detriment in reliance on the promise. So we've got that E and or language again. Promisor, the person making the promise. Promisee, the person getting the benefit of the promise. Now, when you think about it, the easiest way to think about consideration, so consideration needs to move to the promisor, But in any contract, there are two promisors and two promisees. So consideration moves both ways. If I offer to sell you something for an amount of money and you accept, I have promised to transfer the thing to you. There are some implied promises there. I am transferring it to you without any encumbrance. I own it. I've got the right to transfer it to you. There are a whole lot of bundled promises there, but you pay me the money, I will transfer this thing to you. In exchange for my promise to do that, you actually promise to pay me. So you promise to give me money in exchange for me giving you the thing unencumbered with ownership. You are promising me that you have the money or that you can get access to it by the payment date. We are exchanging promises. So this is everything that you need to know about contract law or consideration on one slide. I do like to try and get everything on one slide where I can. The real question that we're asking is not just is there consideration, but for a contract to be binding, we need there to be legally sufficient consideration. I am not going to be able to make that balance in the right spot. So is the consideration sufficient? And there's a twofold test, and we need to go down both arms of the test. Firstly, actually, step one is, do we need consideration at all? So there are a small number of circumstances where we can enter into agreements without any consideration being required. The easiest and most straightforward of those is to document the agreement by way of a deed. So a deed is a particular type of instrument or documentation that has been developed under the laws of equity. And deeds, they used to have to be printed or put together on vellum or parchment. Vellum is deer skin, so I find that kind of revolting in a roundabout way, but those have gone now. They still do need to be on paper though. So they need to be a physical document. So if there is no consideration and you document it on so you need a physical documentation for a deed, it needs to be signed, sealed and delivered. So not just signed by the parties, but actually delivered to them, exchanged. Some act of delivery needs to happen. We'll talk about it in some more detail when we get there, but so you understand, it's not just a document that says deed on the top. So it's a particular type of instrument. Also, if a promissory estoppel operates, you might not need consideration. Now, promissory estoppel, again, we'll go into a little bit more detail about it. You deal with estoppel in more detail in advanced contracts. But there's a big difference between a deed and a promissory estoppel. A deed is something you control. The parties agree that they're going to document their arrangement in a deed. And they do that. A promissory estoppel is something that the courts find. Again, you have no control over that. You might go into court with an argument as to why a promissory estoppel should happen. So a promissory estoppel is effectively an equitable right that arises in a party that means that they can stop another party from exercising some right they otherwise would have. In this case, it's the right to deny a contract even though there is no consideration, and they would create that equitable estoppel on the basis of some kind of reliance. But it's completely outside of your control. So one of the things I often see in assignments is people saying, oh, well, we'll create this so there's an equitable estoppel or an equity. It's like, well, you can have a go, but I think just the evidence that you're putting that in a memo now is probably going to make it much harder for you to do that in court down the track. So assuming we don't have a deed, because the deed is something we can control, or that there isn't a clear equitable estoppel argument, the next step we have to ask is these two chains. Have we met the benefit detriment requirement? And has that benefit or detriment been given or received in exchange for the promises that were made? is there a bargain? So when we we'll unpack what the promises are, so the conferring of a benefit and the giving rise to a legal detriment, what those things look like. And then in relation to bargain, then we need to be able to distinguish just from straight reliance. So again, it'll probably be next week before we do them in depth, but they're the two prongs to this argument of what consideration is. And then we spend the rest of our time, effectively talking, well, Catherine, stop moving things around. Effectively talking about the things that consideration is not, or the rules that relate to consideration. So the top three here, consideration needs to move from the promisee, not necessarily to the promisor, but the promisee needs to give something, exchange something for the benefit of the promise that has been made. Now, they might pay it to somebody else or make a promise to somebody else. I personally think that can get very confusing. Consideration needs to move both ways. We need to see that there is, for every promise that is made, there is a corresponding benefit or detriment made in exchange for that promise. But the language in the cases talks about it moving from the promisee. It's quite easy to unpick it when you stand above that and think about, if I make a promise, I need the beneficiary of that promise to either suffer a detriment or provide me with a benefit in exchange for the promise that I made in order for my promise to be binding. Consideration need not be adequate, but it must be sufficient. So again, going right back up to the beginning here, this idea of legally sufficient consideration, I'll get there eventually, we need it to be legally sufficient. It doesn't need to be adequate. By that I mean that it doesn't need to, the promises don't need to have equal value. The courts are not going to make an assessment of the value of the promises, they just need to see that the value has been exchanged. Key case in relation to that is, well, Nestle is the UK case, but Woolworths, Justice Kirby's decision in Woolworths is the most helpful to you in relation to that. Past consideration is not good consideration. There are some exceptions to that and we will delve into them, but effectively that goes back to this idea that the promises that are made need to be exchanged for each other, for the bargain. So something that you did in the past can't be consideration for a promise that I make today. Then we have a couple of other exceptions that we need to think about. Part payment of a debt will not be good consideration for a promise to waive part of that debt. So if I owe you $100 and I say I'm not going to pay that, and you say, look, I'll reduce your debt to $80 if you pay me $80, there is my payment of that $80 is not good consideration for your promise to reduce the debt. And the next day, I'm looking at you, William, I can tell that you are going to sue me for that extra 20 bucks. The next day, you could bring an action for non-payment of the debt. But there are a number of exceptions and we will work through those. Also, performing a pre-existing legal duty will not be sufficient consideration, will not be good consideration. So my request, or your promise to pay me $100 for showing up at class at 6:30 next Monday night, my promise to show up when actually that's my existing legal duty, is to show up under my contract with the university at 6:30, prepared and ready to run a class. So my showing up cannot, or my promise to do that cannot be consideration for your promise to pay me $100 for doing that, because I already had that duty. Again, there are some exceptions to all of those things, but that's pretty much everything that you need to know. Your name is gone.
Eliza.
Eliza. Thank you, Eliza.
Gone.
It's just gone. It went. It went. It's just. Is that your real name, or did you just make that up because your real one's gone?
No, it's
Sorry, I just.
Is it like in order to establish that there's sufficient consideration, you need to do both prongs? It's not an either or.
There's-
You need to go down both.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. A good observation. So they are both. We need to see a benefit detriment. But basically, since woolen mills in Australia, it has been clear that benefit detriment is not enough. The benefit detriment needs to be in exchange for the promise. So there needs to be this bargain requirement. So, first one to look at is just this idea of a deed. So if we've got a deed, then we don't need to inquire any further at all, okay? It's probably a little bit superficial, but in this course that is enough for what it is that you're going to be faced with. Because there are... Deeds live in the world of equity. Equity has a whole heap of maxims. You will learn about them when you do equity and trust. They include things like equity will not assist a volunteer. So if there is no consideration, then it may well be that there's no promise. When do you actually want, when is consideration an issue? And you might want to use a deed. So a couple of examples, particularly when you don't know what the subject matter is. So good example is non-disclosure agreements or confidentiality agreements are often structured as deeds, because effectively I am making a promise to keep something a secret in the future, and actually we don't even know what that future looks like or what that promise might look like and who's going to get the benefit of that. So it's often they're done as deeds. Probably the one you come across the most often are settlement deeds, where William and I have had a fight over that $80, $100 debt. You know, we've got lawyers at 10 paces, and then he decides to agree to settle it with me. And I don't want, you know, so we agree that I'll pay him another 10 and that will extinguish it all, but I'm not going to get caught out again. So I don't want this to happen. But there's no consideration for that promise because we're reducing that debt. But if we enter into a deed of settlement where neither of us make any promises about the future, other than our dispute is final and that payment is in full and final settlement and that nobody's going to sue anymore, there might be no actual consideration, but we've structured it as a deed, so it won't matter. Just let me have a quick look here about what else I want to talk about. I'll just flip forward to this slide that I made today and then we will finish for today, and we'll come back to all of this next week, I promise. Thinking about where consideration sits, I think it's useful to think about the differences between a gift and a commercial exchange. So the idea of consideration is, in order for a contract to be legally binding, then every time that we have a contract, there needs to be consideration, there needs to be a benefit or a detriment on both sides. If we have a gift, even a conditional gift, we're not expecting a gift to be binding. There are certain circumstances where a gift has legal input. For example, if I leave you something in my will, there's a legal connection between the will and your right to receive the gift. But up until I die, assuming I'm of sound mind, etc., and the will is properly made, I can change my mind on that at any time, and there's nothing that you can do. There might be statutory things that you can do if you are one of my beneficiaries, but one of my dependents, but I'm pretty sure none of you are my dependents, so I should be right in saying that. So a gift is something you can change your mind at any time. In a contract, the idea is that a contract will always be enforced in the same way, and that that means a promise made should be enforceable. And so the consideration, that promise is made in exchange for another promise or something else, another promise or the goods or services. So in Curry and Misa, which is sort of one of the oldest cases that you'll have to look at, but probably one of the most informative in relation to what consideration is, Justice Lush said consideration is a valuable consideration. So it talks about that word value in the sense of the law. Valuable in the sense of the law. Not equal value, but valuable in the sense of the law. May consist in some right, interest, profit or benefit accruing to one party, or on the other hand, the forbearance, detriment, loss or responsibility given, suffered or undertaken by the other. And then we need to add to that the benefit conferred, excuse the spelling, that's terrible, the benefit conferred on the promisor or the detriment suffered by the promisee must be given in return for the promise. I will fix the typos on those slides before I share them with you because they are slightly updated from last time. In the meantime, questions, concerns, frustrations, compliments, or just say hello. You know how to find me. Have a great week, and I will see you next Monday night. And then I need to remind you that we have a session the following Saturday as well in the afternoon, and the rooms keep changing, so look out for that.
What's the date of that?
Is it the 13th of April in the afternoon?
Do you know what time?
2 o'clock in the afternoon, I think, because I wanted to go to parkrun in the morning. And I thought you might, I think we've got 3 hours. Might be 2 hours because of the way it's moved. Saturday afternoon session. It's the makeup class because we're in week 4, but we're actually in week 5. It's to make up for the long weekend.
Do we have to come here or somewhere?
You don't have to. You can do it by the recording. Nothing is ever compulsory. But yeah, it'll be an on. Oh, I don't know. I guess I could put it out there and see if people would prefer it as a.
No, you said nothing's compulsory.
Well, nothing's compulsory. Yeah, well, the assignments aren't compulsory. It's just you don't do enough of them, you won't pass. Like technically, you could not go to the exam. You could not do any. But nothing is compulsory. We have no hurdles. Let me stop my recording because this is just getting silly.